Hi, I am Dr. Julie Nelson, and I am a doctor of traditional Chinese medicine here at Chi Integrated Health in Vancouver, BC. Today we're going to look at how our emotions drive our physical well-being, specifically our gut health. So if you find these videos interesting or helpful, please consider subscribing and hit the red button below, and feel free to share them with your friends. So as a doctor of Chinese medicine, I treat a lot of patients whose health issues are a direct result of emotional and physical trauma. The reason I'm doing these YouTube videos is to create more awareness around our emotional state and our physical state. In short, if you have suffered from severe emotional trauma, there's a high likelihood you're also suffering from severe health issues and effects as well. So today we're going to look at a patient I started treating about 3 years ago, and due to patient confidentiality, I will use a pseudonym to protect her privacy. So Lauren, when she came to see me, was 25 years old, and she was on a medical leave at the time due to very frequent panic attacks. She'd been suffering from anxiety for the past 15 years, but her panic attacks at that time were happening about every 2 to 3 days, triggered by her job. She was in a tech startup. She had constant tremors in her hands. Her core body, her trunk was very hot, but her hands and feet were freezing cold. Her anxiety caused her to feel nauseous, and she would vomit frequently, and the rib cage area, so when you take your ribs and run them down the side of your body, just where the rib cage ends, that area there, would get super hot as well. Now, in Chinese medicine, we would call this liver qi stagnation, or liver overacting on the stomach and causing rebellious stomach qi. And in other words, her energy was flowing the wrong way. So in Chinese medicine, your stomach energy goes down. It takes food and waste, the byproducts down and go out. Spleen energy goes up. And so when these get reversed, the stomach energy, when it goes up, you'll feel that nauseous, gaseous, vomity kind of feeling. So what was happening is all of that pent-up anxiety that she was feeling around her job was causing the qi to create this big balloon of energy. And again, we always tend to think of that verklempt feeling when we can't swallow. We get that big tight feeling in our throat, and no matter how hard we try to swallow, it won't go down. Imagine that happening in your gut and in your lower intestine. And that's what was happening to Lauren. She also was suffering from bad temporal headaches. So temporal headaches here, caused largely by clenching her jaw. So when people get really tight and anxious, they tend to either clench their jaw or grind their teeth at night and wear a mouth guard. A mouth guard is an indication that you're probably holding a lot of tension in your body. So headaches, and then she also had bloating and was diagnosed with IBS. Irritable bowel syndrome. Again, another red flag. Her IBS got worse the more stressed out she got, to the point where she was constantly feeling nauseous, stabbing pain, bloating, constipation. And she also suffered from horrible periods. The month before she came to see me, she was bleeding constantly. So her period just wasn't ending. It was just a continuous flow of blood. She also was suffering from chronic sinus infections and ear infections. And on top of that, she had to urinate all the time and would wake up and have to go pee in the night. So let's take a step back. Lauren at that time was 25 years old. And from the outward appearances, she was a beautiful, seemingly capable young woman. Yet her body was racked with illness, and in fact, chronic illness, chronic sinus, chronic ear infections, IBS. And when your period basically flows all the time, your body is so dysregulated because your hormones are dysregulated. And what causes that? Adrenaline. Adrenaline affects the cortisol levels. So it all becomes one big system that is basically broken. This is what extreme trauma looks like in the body. This is how trauma manifests itself in the body. And these are the kinds of symptoms that I see in patient after patient who come to see me because they're having stomach trouble. Now, admittedly, Lauren was an extreme example. A lot of people come just because they've got gut issues. In her case, she just checked off every box that we had. Headaches, irregular periods, IBS, bloating, all that kind of stuff. So what was the root cause of Lauren's issue? It was her dad. And so her trauma basically was twofold. Her dad was a survivor of sexual abuse as a child. He unfortunately never sought help for it, and in turn he became the emotional abuser to his own family. So alcohol and drugs and rage were his basic coping mechanisms. Her mother was abused by her sister. And again, abused people tend to find other abused people, and together, if left untreated, they can recreate an abusive household for their children. And that was the case in Lauren's case. And also, when you have generational trauma, it tends to become epigenetics. So you may not actually have a mother who was traumatized, but you might have had a grandmother who was traumatized. And I see that generational in family members who have had family members in Auschwitz or concentration camps, and you tend to see high anxiety issues come down through the generations. So the breaking point came for Lauren after she had spent a weekend at the family cabin with her father's rage and abuse out of control. Her body shut down. So she actually had to be carried off the ferry because she just physically was unable to move. Like physically, she shut down. So it was Lauren who first showed me how intense emotions affect not only our mind, but our gut. And through her, I could see the devastating impact our emotions have on our physical well-being. Intense emotions signal our sympathetic nervous system. So sympathetic, think fight or flight, which releases adrenaline. This speeds up our heart rate and increases our blood pressure. And we typically will go into fight or flight mode when being confronted with danger. In Lauren's case, her father's behavior would trigger a flight response. However, in her case, she was unable to get away from her father, who essentially was a terrifying caregiver. Then she moves into the last stage of response, which is collapse and shut down. So if you can't get away and the abuse keeps coming, you will essentially not be able to move if it's that severe. So the first symptom that always appeared in Lauren's case is when she got triggered, her gut would start to flare up. She would get bloating, pain, diarrhea, and loss of appetite. And every time she spent extended periods of time with her father in that closed setting on an island in a cabin, it would trigger her gut response to the point where she would just have wicked stomach pain, wicked bloating. And that's the thing. So her father was triggering her gut responses. And so experiences shape our brain. And after trauma, the world is experienced with a different nervous system that has an altered perception of risk and safety. And almost all mental suffering involves either trouble creating workable, satisfying relationships. So mental suffering, where we have trouble creating satisfying relationships, or we have difficulty regulating our arousal. And in Lauren's case, she had both. So she wanted a relationship with her father. It's natural to have a relationship, yet it was an angry, abusive, and it didn't meet Lauren's needs. And what would happen is when she was around him, she didn't have a voice. She didn't have a way of regulating herself to say, oh, Dad's getting really angry. I need to take a step back now because that's Dad's anger. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm going to go for a walk on the beach. The problem is she would get drawn into his drama, and it became like an emotional punching bag. So a father who is abusive and unsafe to be around, which caused her to feel unsafe, unheard, and able to get her basic needs met. So she had no voice, and she had no way of stopping his verbal attacks. And once her father started acting in this manner, Lauren had no ability to process the attacks, meaning she could not regulate her body's response to this danger. She wasn't able to step outside of herself and say, oh, wait a minute here, that's okay, that's Dad, I'm going to take a step back. If she was able to do that, then her gut would settle down. The fact that she couldn't triggered all kinds of flight responses in her, and the gut would start to shut down. So moving forward, how did Lauren recover? And by the way, she's doing great now. So what happened was her collapse on the ferry really highlighted and drew attention to her emotional state. In short, she went about work fixing her life. So what did she do? She first spoke to her employer and openly shared about her mental health and was able to take a leave to seek treatment. And when she ultimately returned to work, it was to a reduced work schedule responsibility. So working in a tech startup probably was not the ideal situation for Lauren. Even though she's very familiar with intense, stressful situations, she grew up in one, it wasn't something that was serving her for the future. So she basically cut back her work hours. She came for acupuncture and healing touch to regulate her autonomic nervous system. We needed to get her to safe, to settle down her gut. So we wanted to move her from the fight and flight to the rest and digest, so her stomach could begin working again. We also looked at the kinds of food she was eating. Again, warm cooked foods, soups, ginger, things that are easy to break down and digest. Cold, crunchy, raw vegetables, worst thing in the world you can do when you are having irritable bowel syndrome. You need easy foods to digest, because in her case, she would often slip into constipation as opposed to diarrhea. And then the other really important thing is she found a therapist to help her unlock her emotional trauma. So she needed to start working on it, talking about it. The other thing Lauren did, and I highly support this as well, is she continued to stay on medication for her anxiety. In her case, when you go into a situation where your body shuts down and you physically can't move, at that point, you're probably going to need a stronger intervention. You're going to need some type of medication to override that flight mechanism. And when we're in a state of crisis, which was often in her case, she couldn't process with her rational brain. She wasn't able to say, hey, it's okay, I'm going to be okay. The emotional side of it just took over. So that's when medication really came in handy and was necessary for her. And our relationships in these cases, especially with our parents, make things very emotional. And in these cases, we need help to sort out what healthy relationships should look and feel like. And often as victims of abuse, we blame ourselves for our situation. I'm not enough. What did I do? And we end up taking on a lot of our parents' pain and abuse and blame ourselves for not being enough or not able to fix it. Or worse, we've triggered them. We just sort of take it in and we hold it. Okay? A wounded person will wound others around them. And especially if they're a parent, they can do incredible damage to their children until they themselves seek help. So, and if we're unable to stay in the present and process what's happening to us, our rational brain will often slip into the emotional brain, and this is where the trauma takes place in the body. This is where we will see the gut give out, or the thyroid, in this case sometimes hypothyroid, our breathing, asthma. Traumatized children have 50 times the rate of asthma as their non-traumatized peers. Okay, so how do we shift people out of the fight-flight responses, the disorganized perceptions of danger, and increase their ability to manage and maintain social relationships and maintain themselves, manage to regulate themselves? And often I think when you look at how we try to regulate our emotions, if we're in that disorganized state, we will turn to unhealthy coping mechanisms. Things like alcohol, drugs, sex, binge eating, and cutting has become a big one for helping people to release emotion and release that pent-up pressure that they're feeling. So the biggest one is, first, it's always going to be awareness. Awareness. The realization that you're in an unhealthy relationship and it's causing you pain. Pain will lead to healing. The other one that I talked about earlier is agency, and there's that magic word again. We have to know what we're feeling. If it's fear, anger, jealousy, resentment, we have to know what we feel in order to know why we feel that way. And if we are aware of, and we got to be aware of the changes that are happening inside our body. When do I start to feel anxious? When does my throat start to constrict? When do I start to feel my gut clench and that tightness feeling in my chest? If we can stay with those feelings instead of just slipping right into that old panic mode, then we can start to unpack them. So agency is knowing what we feel, knowing where we feel it, and being able to observe it, and then starting to speak up for it. Again, counseling. EMDR is still my go-to, but sometimes EMDR might be too strong. It might be too much to go back to those very painful memories. There might need to be a segue into that. It may take you a year before you can start to do some EMDR trauma counseling, but counseling is a must. And in Lauren's case, again, as I said earlier, we looked at her diet. We did the acupuncture. So in her case, and I think in a lot of people's cases where there's severe trauma, there may not be one bullet out. You probably are going to have to put together a team of people, practitioners, to help you. One with the physical side of the manifestation and one with the emotional side of the manifestation. And then the other thing is mindfulness practice, meditation, being able to sit with our bodies, being able to observe what's going on, being able to understand how you feel. The physical self-awareness is the first step to releasing the tyranny of the past. So work on describing the feelings in your body. And I always ask patients, what are you feeling and how are you feeling it? Are your shoulders tense? Are you getting a lot of headaches? Does your chest feel really tight? When the panic attacks come, does your chest feel like it's beating wildly and out of control? Are you sweating profusely? What's happening with your gut? Are you running to the washroom all the time? Do you have a lot of diarrhea? And the other one that I really love is yoga. Why do we love yoga? Because it's a blend of mindful practice and exercise. It's kind of the best of both worlds. You're breathing, so a longer exhale helps regulate the sympathetic nervous system. And then the other thing is to really find people that you trust, have a support system. We often carry these baggages with shame, and we don't want to disclose family secrets. We don't want to let on that anything is less than okay and great, because these are deep, deep, deep wounds, and often we feel like we're the only ones that have experienced these things growing up. But being able to find people that you hold dear to you, that will hold your secrets, that will offer you a safe place to land, that will create space for you to tell your story, these are super important as well. And then next time we're going to do some more fundamental things. Like in Lauren's case, she would go and plunge into the ocean, and that reset her sympathetic nervous system. So it took her to flight and put her into rest and digest. And cold shock water will do that. And so every day she would go down and she would jump in the ocean and float for 10 minutes. So we're going to start to look at more of these types of things as we move forward. But my other big one for coping is physical activity. Physical activity runs that energy. It runs the fear. So biking, walking, yoga, movement, swimming, going to the gym. It's really important if you suffer from anxiety to move, because it helps channel that energy. So I'm going to go on. I could go on, but I'm going to stop here today. And I will continue to create these YouTube videos. So please feel free to share them. Feel free to leave feedback and subscribe. Thank you very much for watching.